and welcome to the King Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, I'm going to start us on a different type of journey than I had before. It's probably going to at least cover another show or two. I want to go through our realms of desire and pleasure and this intriguing phenomenon known as emotional bleed post scenes, post plays that we do. So basically the after effects of what happens to us once we have ended a scene. Sometimes we talk about the floating effect when we are done days or even weeks later after a scene, depending on the intensity of a scene and how that affects us in our day-to-day lives. Because for the vast majority of people that are inside of the BDSM world, even those that may even claim to live it 24/7, there are some integral moments of their life where they're grounded in reality. We're not grounded still in the fantasy of the concept itself. So before we really dive into more of how this affects our world of BDSM and emotional bleed combined, we need to understand first what emotional bleed is. Now, emotional bleed is defined by many experts in psychology and consumer behavior. And this phenomenon is where emotions from intense experiences like a BDSM scene extend beyond that experience, and they really affect a person's emotional state in their everyday life. It's kind of like boundaries between the fantasy and reality begin to blur, and they leave this emotional imprint that linger long after a scene is over. Now, discussion was first brought up about for those in the LARPing world. If you're not familiar with that, LARPing is live action roleplay, Dungeons and Dragons, Westworld, Harry Potter, so on and so forth. Things like of these activities. There was even actually a study that was done about this by somebody who participates in this world, and it's called There and Back Again: Bleed from Extraordinary Experiences. I'm going to actually dive a little bit into that as well, when we basically we're struggling on certain levels to bring ourselves out of the fantasy and back into reality. And in one particular case of this anecdote of this paper, he had talked about an experience where he fell in love with somebody who wasn't real, this person, and the extraordinary effects of how that then translated into his everyday life, and how much emotional blurring that really left between these two different realities that he was alternating between. So how does emotional bleed manifest in the realm inside of our world, inside of our community, in the BDSM sphere? Especially in an area where we navigate all of these boundaries of erotic pleasure and risk. Now, it offers us a very unique platform for risk-taking in a consensual and controlled environment, right? If we're going to go by all things are static. So it's interesting to note when I'm looking at that and I'm reading this and we're looking at human behavior, human sexual behavior, we have to discuss how the intensity, the engagement, the temporality of the extraordinary experiences at play, more specifically in a role play type of environment, lead us into emotional bleed. Now, within the context of BDSM, the intense sensations we feel, this emotional engagement that we are involved with, certainly would fit the bill of emotional bleed. But what really happens when we return from these extraordinarily extensive experiences? And that becomes the next real big issue. So to really understand this emotional aftermath, if you will, of our BDSM scenes, we need to venture into the world that we understand and know. And we have to understand the scenes, like intense impacts, or a couple weeks ago I talked about a burial scene, or needle play, or suspensions, all of these different parts of the world where we're giving more of ourselves into riskier type behaviors, and that we're transcending a part of our lives and then leaving part of ourselves still with inside of that scene. And we have to understand that it can become quite difficult for us in the management of these parallel worlds. And that sometimes can leave us in these altered states. It's when we hear about dom drop or sub drop, right? And these are the states where they're coming down and they seem to crash quite emotionally hard, because we're having a problem drawing back into the parallel of the real world in the real time, because many people are probably going to work after scenes over a weekend, and they've got bruises, and, they're covering up, not because they're trying to hide who they are, but because, if a coworker sees that, or a parent or something like that, fear and worry is going to come in. I don't want to dive too much in that because this becomes a different world. But when we look at these parallels between the emotional aftermath experienced by individuals in our community and this bleed described in this paper, it's people who are participating in these extremely immersive experiences, individuals inside of our community who are engaging in very intense scenes. They face these emotional challenges transitioning back, right? Bleed manifests in all of these ways. It can be a catharsis, it can be identity exploration, an emotional release. So how do we navigate what's starting out here? How do individuals within the BDSM community deal with the emotional processing and the emotional after effects? And how do we manage the potential for emotional bleed? Well, one of the key factors is something that I come back to all the time. I talk about communication. I talk about how we're feeling, relaying our emotional state, and, having a good dialogue between myself and my partner. This can be a little bit more difficult if you're not really with someone, maybe somebody who's identifying more as a bottom. So they're not really playing in the world of DS, but they're just kind of there for the experience and then leaving. I would love to maybe have somebody on that would talk about that kind of effect for them, where, they're kind of just in it for the moment, then they're out and they're done. And so how they separate that. But for the individuals that are a little bit deeper, that are having, they might be in a DS or in the beginning of the DS relationship and they're starting their journey, or for some of the people that are quite deep into it, they're willing to push further, right? We start talking about risk and how are we communicating all the thoughts and feelings that we have. Now, this whole discussion for me was inspired by somebody I had on the show, Miss Kitten, a couple of months back. Great podcast, by the way. We talked about needle play and the extensive ways that she prepares going to a potential needle play scene with a play partner, and which that even touched on the emotional and the mental, and how important that is that somebody's in the right headspace, because we're not only managing where we are prior to the scene and the scene itself, we're also talking about mitigation of our emotional state and our psychological state after. And it's not something that I think a lot of people do, or we don't bring up these discussions because we don't know how we're going to handle them. It's because I don't think we understand what some of the effects are, and it's why a lot of people, I think, recommend starting with lighter things so we can understand, and then with dominants and submissives constantly checking in to deal with the after effects of what that scene entailed, breaking it down, how they're feeling, where they are at days and weeks later. It's like when I talked about the burial scene, the follow-ups for those people were 2, 3, 4 weeks later with medical professionals as well as psychological professionals. and making sure that somebody was still on the status quo, describing their experiences, and that there was no some sort of bleed after the effect where they're feeling something after that intense scene. So, if we can all agree that extensive communication and a strong focus are on our consent levels, and we realize that this is fundamental, that ensuring that our risk taking remains a consensual and controlled endeavor. If all participants are actively discussing their desires and their limits and their expectations, which is what we do beforehand, we're starting to cover definitely more in the beginning, the before part, and the middle or the at the moment part. We have to incorporate the after, and it's not just aftercare. It has to be seen through on the intensity, because intensity for different people, that emotional bleed over can be left for days or weeks on end, because we're not going to really understand if we're going into a scene where we are being suspended from our hair and being choked while being whipped and maybe electrocuted or whatever somebody's getting involved in, and how that's going to affect them days later. It can affect their sleep, their dream state. So we're talking about things manifesting physiologically from the emotional aspects of what they encountered. Now, what's interesting is that in this paper that Arazi and Van Leer's research highlighted was the role of subjective understanding in the bleed intensity. Now, what was fascinating about that was us as BDSM practitioners rely on this open communication within our relationships, right? We're supposed to empathize or emphasize empathy and vulnerability and harp and focus on this essential component of the dynamic, especially when it comes to managing post-scene emotional consequences. Do we all do this? No, I'm not saying that every relationship does this. Maybe we all don't know. I mean, we may have to start considering like classes in this and why it is important, because we have to understand that the narratives of each person are going to change before when a scene is being built or being discussed, during or at the moment the scene is going to be conceived and done, and then the after effects when the scene is over. And it doesn't just end when the scene is done. Of course, that does come down to the negotiation between two people, and we do realize that. So I'm not overemphasizing for those who don't want aftercare, but you have to put yourself into the context of how necessary it may be depending on the intensity, what you think, and how well you are emotionally grounded. I'm not saying that each person should probably have a psychological assessment done before they're getting into something, but in some of these scenes, you may want to spend a little bit more time, depending on their intensity, to see what somebody's state is. You know, have they had a bad day? Or, you know, had somebody recently passed away in their life? Are they struggling with something, you know, interpersonal? And we have to understand that emotional bleed, while this whole concept is intriguing, it leads to these unexpected emotions. And how do we emphasize this within the community to deal with this? Well, I mean, not expecting everybody to go out and become a trained therapist and to gain the knowledge in every area. I don't have the knowledge. This was an interesting area for me to go in and look at. So what can we do what kind of strategies can we come up with for managing these emotional after effects to really highlight more communication and support? Now, as we start to understand here in the beginning, and we're kind of like looking at this like emotional bleed and risk like a onion, as we peel back each one of these layers, we have to acknowledge the role of risk in our human sexual behavior. Now, risk for us manifests in various forms, driving individuals to explore these boundaries both mentally and physically within BDSM and beyond. This isn't just really kind of centered or focused just on the BDSM world. This can be in part of any risk, type of behavior. Swingers that have decided to, I don't know, maybe go out to some some random island and have a orgy out there, and what kind of risks are involved with doing that, from those who might see you to anything else. It's all these risks involved, and then the after effect of, great, I did it, and it was a really cathartic high, and then what I'm feeling now after the fact I shouldn't have, and how I'm feeling down or upset about the decision I made. Now, regardless of how much we understand and know ourselves and understand what depths, we don't know what's going to end up happening in our unconscious, the part of our mind that we have no control over. So we need to look more at this interplay of risk in our emotional aftermath. Now, if this interplay between risk and the subsequent emotional aftermath is both intricate and profound, at its core then, BDSM would thrive on this delicate balance between trust and consent and pushing those boundaries. Now, we all know that we're willingly ready to engage in scenarios that challenge our emotional and physical limits, and they create this atmosphere where risk takes center stage. For many of us, we thrive on it. We like pushing the boundaries. It becomes the allure that BDSM often lies in this capacity to provide an experience that's both intensely thrilling and emotionally charged. The element of risk itself inside of BDSM encompasses a broad spectrum, ranging from the subtle psychological challenges to the more physically intense encounters. But that doesn't diminish the capacity within, that the psychological impact won't be there. Now, we know that risk within inside of our lifestyle can manifest as the unknown, the unexpected, and the daring. Now, regardless if we're looking at setting up a scene and we're trying to do risk mitigation. So we're dealing with the physical, right? We're checking our ropes. We're making sure, cuffs are in order. Nothing is rusted. Whatever we're doing, we're trying to mitigate as much harm to somebody as possible, because obviously that's not the point. Willfully and wanting harm versus or hurt over harm. We don't want to harm our partners. But we can't always mitigate the one risk, which is the emotional. So this becomes this daring playground where those of us inside of this intentionally traverse these uncharted territories of sensation and emotion and power dynamics. This intricate interplay of domination and submission, coupled with the element of surprise, provides us this unique avenue for people who are thrill-seeking to satiate their appetite in an erotic sense for novelty and heightened stimulation. Now, we understand that part of this draw to our lifestyle resides in the uncertainty and risk associated with that unknown and where we are willing to go, where that boundary between pleasure and discomfort becomes tantalizingly thin. For some people, they enjoy the discomfort more than the pleasure. The thrilling dimension of our lifestyle offers individuals from all ranges the opportunity to challenge these limits both mentally and physically in the pursuit of the heightened sense of excitement and satisfaction, but not at the cost of disregarding the after effects of what may happen to us in the first place. Now, the intensity of risk within our scenes gives rise to a complex emotional aftermath. We all may, at some given point, experience a broad range of emotions post-scene, from the euphoria, catharsis, to vulnerability and introspection. And when I'm sitting here, what for me comes to mind is the first time I went to this club when I was in Atlanta. I went to this dungeon. And it was a very wonderful weekend. There was a DomCon going on. And that night, the dungeon was hosting scenes and different scenes going on. There was needle play and electrotorture and bondage and water sports going on. And I'll never forget that when I walked in there, and I was very young, and the community was welcoming, but I remember feeling that it was such an emotional overload that it was days, if not weeks afterwards, I was still talking about it with my mentor at the time, about how it affected me and everything I saw. I remember that day that when I saw somebody getting needles placed in their back and then a corset being tied, and it was a beautiful display. But how it made me feel, I remember the hairs on my arm standing up, getting goose pimples, but I felt very numb. And I didn't know how to translate that at the time to how I was feeling. That for days later, I was having trouble sleeping because all of these thoughts and images were rolling around in my mind. So, in essence, when we look at this through an introspective lens, this emotional aftermath is really an integral part to our experience within the lifestyle itself. And it's essential for us to recognize its significance. Individuals, depending on who you are or where you are in the lifestyle, may find themselves grappling with these feelings of emotional release, contentment, or even emotional exhaustion. And this intricate dance between risk and emotional aftermath underscores the unique nature of BDSM as a consensual and evolving practice. And it's within this dynamic interplay that participants navigate their desires, their boundaries, and the profound emotional terrain that unfolds after their adventures in pleasure and risk taking end. And I don't think I could stress that enough. I'm not an orator, and I'm not a gatekeeper. There's certain things I do gatekeep against as far as our community, but the reality is no one controls anyone. No one controls anyone else. But it doesn't mean that what we're trying not to pass along or the discussions that I'm having aren't relevant. They are relevant. We don't sometimes give ourselves enough credit that we may not be able to handle something we're involved in. So, as we dive deeper into the realm of the BDSM world, as we go down that rabbit hole, we really and truly begin to understand the motivations that drive ourselves to explore these boundaries of pleasure while dealing with this complex emotional landscapes that follow. We have to be willing to give ourselves the break and allow ourselves the possibility to understand that we may be affected emotionally or psychologically after the fact that a scene ends. Not just what it's like before the scene begins and we're building up to the scene, whether we're the submissive and the anticipation is growing, or we're the dominant and we're designing the scene. We're not worried just about the moment that the scene is about to happen or the scene is happening, because then we're in the moment and we're enjoying it and we're escaping from ourselves. We are talking those moments that are after the fact and how important that is to our emotional and psychological state. And it's really quite interesting when we start looking at these parallels and understanding how we start to separate ourselves in these worlds. Now, this topic is quite large. I'm going to probably do either another follow-up this week, or it's definitely by next week, but maybe later this week I'll put out a second episode on this, because this is I want to do more justice to this discussion. But this kind of cracks the door open a little bit so we can start understanding these emotional effects and allow ourselves some rooms to look at ourselves in an introspective manner and ask ourselves the question of, how am I feeling afterwards? So now that we've kind of started our journey here on risk and desire, this concept of emotional bleed, we're starting to peel back a couple more layers inside of our lifestyle. We're shedding light on intimacy and our erotic pleasure. And we're starting to understand more of this complex interplay between human psychology and our sexual experiences. And I'm hoping through this we get within to another part of the realm that we live inside of the lifestyle, where we start to understand more about risk and reward and how they dance hand in hand with each other, especially with the emotional consequences that linger long after these scenes have ended. Sometimes days. I've known people it's weeks or even months later. We've got to remember and keep something in mind, that the foundation of our community lies in communication and consent. These are what guide us to ensure that we have safe and exciting and fulfilling experiences. But we have to remember that it doesn't just stop there, and we can't just stop caring once the scene ends, that we have to move and carry that empathy forward. Now, on the next part of my show, or for the next episode, I'm going to get into a little bit deeper. We're going to go into the intersection where substance abuse, sensation-seeking personalities, and emotional aftermath and BDSM kind of coexist, and the heavy risk that's involved. I'm going to be looking at chemical impairment, how this is amplifying emotions but blurs the line between pleasure, risk, and consent. And I think that's really important that we have to talk about it, especially when I'm starting to see more and more dungeons globally that are including bars inside of their dungeon spaces, or people who are admitting to substance or chemical abuse prior to play and the effects of that. Please let me know what you think about this episode. I'm going to put up some thoughts or questions on emotional bleed, and I'd like to get some feedback from the community on that. If you follow me on Spotify, and if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars. For some reason, some recent discussions in social media where I contradict people with logic and fact has upset people, and they've intentionally just downgraded my show just because they don't like me, and I find that to be childish. So I do this because I'm trying to help our community and take us down to another level of understanding. So I do ask, if you like the show, please rate it 5 stars so other people can find it. So with that being said, everybody, until next time, be safe and stay kinky.